my distinguished co-panelists, the panelists who spoke in the previous sessions, Dr. Bhagi and office bearers and executive members of the DUTA and elected representatives and all delegates to this convention. दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय शिक्षक संघ द्वारा आयोजित इस तरह के कार्यक्रम में मुझे बोलने का अवसर मिला है। ये बहुत खुशी की बात है क्योंकि मैंने अपनी जिंदगी के पहले 14 साल पढ़ाने के जो इसी शिक्षक संघ के सदस्य के रूप में गुजारा और यहाँ से बहुत कुछ सीखा है जिसके आधार पर आगे भी काम करते आए हैं। So I'm very happy to be here on such an occasion. I'd also like to congratulate the DUTA for having organized this kind of a convention for two reasons. One is that it's a process where you're bringing together people with diverse perspectives, ideologies to deal with what is a common challenge before the teaching community. And the second reason is that in the history of the teachers movement in India, the DUTA obviously has always been one of the most important leading contingents. And what DUTA does, where it stands, what it does, will always play a very important role in determining what happens to the future of these regulations, which are at draft stage at the moment, and also therefore what happens to the higher education system in the country. So I would like to congratulate DUTA for having stepped forward to take such an initiative. And I hope we will be able to continue this process and cooperate in ensuring that what happens is in the best interests of higher education in this country and of course the teaching community. With regard to the specific theme that is set before this panel, I'd like to preface my discussion about it with, by drawing your attention to two important additional dimensions to the one which has already been highlighted, which is that this is an amendment to or a new set of draft regulations on teacher service conditions which are delinked from any pay revision. That's a point that has already been made. But there are two additional things amongst many other things which I think are important to keep in mind, with reference to which I will also discuss the specific theme of this panel. The first is that this time around, it's not just draft 25 regulations. What used to be in the regulations has been bifurcated into two parts. One is in the regulations, and then there is an associated set of guidelines, which are not regulations. And regulations have a legally binding character which is not applicable to guidelines. So what is the implication of this division between regulations and guidelines? And what has gone into regulations and what has been moved into the guidelines is of significance for understanding the implications of this. The second point I want to draw your attention to is the fact that these regulations are also, along with other regulations that have been also proposed, are bringing, these are regulations within through which the national credit framework is being incorporated into defining our role and work as teachers and the workloads that we will have. Because the national credit framework, and it's important to keep in mind that the national credit framework guidelines specify that in each stage of education, for students, requirements of completing you complete the requirements of one semester when you earn 20 credits. And each credit is equivalent to 30 learning hours. Which means in a semester, it's 600 hours that they must be engaged in the activities which are approved as activities which can count for the purposes of determining whether the credit requirements are met. And these hours do not include any period of self-study by the students, which means it is in one or the other form It is an hour in which there has to be some kind of supervised activity. The responsibility for that supervision, of course, falls on, therefore, teachers. And 600 hours in a semester translates into some 33 hours a week if you have a normal 18-week kind of semester.
15 weeks. 15 weeks.
In 15 it will be even more.
14.
Yeah. So in the number of hours, therefore, each day is 5 to 6 hours for the students. How much of what does it mean in terms of workload that teachers will have to bear collectively? That is one aspect that needs to be also kept in mind. Now, as far as the question of institutional autonomy and caste promotions are concerned, there is of course an important link between these two issues. Institutional autonomy is something that we value not because, what is the purpose of institutional autonomy? After all, institutional autonomy is considered as something essential or important to ensure that higher education institutions and universities are able to discharge their public or social function. It is an essential requirement for that. Institutional autonomy does not mean, therefore, that vice chancellors are allowed to run institutions or universities as they please. It's not their private property. Institutional autonomy does not mean that it is to be their private property. It also does not mean that vice chancellors will run universities according to dictates from whoever happens to be the government of the day, which is appointed them as vice chancellors. It doesn't mean either of these. If then, what does institutional autonomy mean except an autonomy which is rooted in some democratic forms of self-governance of institutions, in which autonomy of individual units within the institution and autonomy of teachers, freedom and autonomy of teachers are essential requirements. The function of a university or any the education process is one which is discharged collectively. It is always a collective enterprise, but it is a collective enterprise in which individuals and individual units must have their freedom and autonomy. It's not to be run like a military. Education institution is not run like a military. Now, if this democratic self-governance and individual autonomy of teachers is, and the constituent units of the, like departments, etc., are important, then it is also important that in there, the question of promotions also becomes important. Because the promotion process as it is one where the teacher's abilities are required to be assessed. And depending upon that assessment, there can be major implications for their career. The problem historically we always have had is that the assessment process, which is designed to assess the teachers and to hold them accountable for their responsibilities, has always been one in which those who organize that assessment process and those who assess themselves, who do the assessment, they are not subject to any assessment or accountability mechanism. That's been historically the problem. That I am supposed to assess you, but I am not accountable in any way for whether I do that assessment properly or not. That imbalance in that process is something that needed to be redressed. But in these UGC regulations, in fact, the opposite seemed to be happening. That the room for arbitrary decisions with regard to caste promotions has been enlarged, because the problems of appointment of vice chancellors, problems associated with constitution of selection committees, the control that administrations have over that process, they have not been addressed in any way. But the discretionary powers given to selection committees has been enlarged enormously. So selection committees can decide anything, and there is nothing in the regulations which prevents them from being completely arbitrary in that process. So if you look at it, so one is selection committees are important for every promotion. No more screening process. In a screening process, you have to look at some papers, criteria, which at least binds you that you can't just decide that someone is unfit or unsuitable for promotion. But in a selection committee, it is different, because the selection committee has to give a judgment about how you performed when you appeared before that selection committee. In all promotions, it is that judgment alone that counts. No other criteria matters except to determine whether you can appear before a selection committee or not. Once you are found to appear before the selection committee has all the powers to decide whether you are suitable or not. You have no defense, no legitimate claim that you can place before such a committee. Not only that, it is not just whether your ability is being judged, but whether you are even meeting the criteria for promotion or not is to be decided by the selection committee. So notable contributions have been mentioned already. So whether your contributions under any one of those 9 heads is notable or not is to be decided by the selection committee. It has the final word on whether it is notable or not, which means you can decide for person X, nothing, who does nothing, it is notable. Person Y does a lot, it is not notable. It is entirely up to the judgment of the selection committee. Similarly, whether your research publications, it's not the quality of your research publications, but whether they are in peer-reviewed journals or not, and whether they have been published by a reputed publisher or not. These are statements of fact which are also to be decided by the selection committee. So, not one, but several instruments have been handed over to selection committees and administration, therefore, to basically deny anyone a promotion. And there's nothing in the regulations which will allow you to defend yourself if you're a victim of such arbitrary action. Even in a court of law, when you go, they will say, where is the law? What is the criteria on the basis of which you say that a certain decision is illegitimate? Then there is a problem about, there is a further problem, which is power given to administrations of deciding when you will get promoted. There is one problem which is about the date, the fixing of these dates of promotion. But those dates will come only after you have been found successful. And you can apply when you are eligible. There is no binding constraint in these regulations, in these draft regulations, on when the administration has the selection committee for your promotion. So you can apply when you are eligible. The selection committee could be held 10 years later. And you will be promoted after that date. The way the date of promotion clause is formulated, administrations can decide when to promote someone, change their date of eligibility at will. Okay, so these are, let's say, the freedoms given to selection committees, which opens up the thing for arbitrary decision making, pick and choose. You want to victimize someone, you want to favor someone, you have all the instruments to do so. The second part is where the restrictions have been imposed. It's been imposed on teachers, where the walls that you have to cross in order to get a promotion have become higher or more stringent. So PhD becomes mandatory where it wasn't earlier. Sole supervision of PhD has to be the criteria that you have to meet in order to get promoted. The number of publications you must have to be eligible, that is increased. Your past service counting is become more restrictive because you have to be appointed under regulations. Now no teacher decides the provisions under which you get appointed. But that will decide whether that service can be counted or not. So the hurdles to getting a promotion when it becomes legitimate review have been enhanced rather than being eased in any form or fashion. Now all of these are also appear to be part of a larger set of things where greater control will be exercised. So where is the room for teachers to exercise their own freedoms and autonomies in this process? Where is the freedom for them? Instead, what is happening is that this is part of a process where the levers of control that administrations can exercise over their teachers has increased. And this increase, it would appear, is likely to be used not just to curb academic freedom and autonomy, but also to significantly increase the workloads that teachers have. Because what has been moved out of the regulations is the provision with regard to workloads. So any norm or minimum standards has to define a maximum load that must be imposed on a teacher. It's a simple logical conclusion that can be derived from the notion of a minimum standard. Any minimum standard has to define that. Instead of that, what is done is that it is shifted to the guidelines and it is left to administrations now to decide what is the workload that teachers must have. And read this along with the national, the credit framework, and you will know what is likely to be in the offing. Because one of the aspects of all regulations which are also important for autonomy is that regulation should also impose some constraints on the UGC itself and on the government to provide the funds which would ensure that institutions can function autonomously and meet all the requirements of minimum standards. Here, there is no such clause. Instead, institutions are being given freedom to use these levers to make teachers also mobilize funds mobilize funds and to save on money by increasing the workload of teachers rather than recruiting. And the contractual employment part adds to that. Contractual employment can be used to further increase control, and it can also be used to deal with this problem of workload. Even other benefits which are important in the career of teachers, like leave, pension, medical benefits, have all been moved out of regulations into the guidelines. So you cannot say the regulation says I'm entitled to so much leave, then you should. That you have to therefore give me that leave when I'm entitled to it, unless you have a valid reason to say no. You can't say that now because it's not in the regulation, it is in the guidelines which are not legally binding. Other benefits are also being brought under these guidelines. And some of these things may appear small, but they can become very big. I'll give you one simple example. If you compare the 2010 and 2018 regulations on probation and confirmation, you will find that they are identical but for one small change, which is that at the end of 1 year, your confirmation is automatic. The word automatic disappears in the 2018 regulation. It was there in the 2010. And probation and confirmation have now been also moved into the guidelines. I come from a university which has created a world record, at least a national record, in terms of the number of teachers appointed relatively recently whose probations have been extended after the completion of 1 year. And they do not have that defense of that one word which was there in the 2010 regulations. What can happen? What can happen once these are also in the guidelines? There is no binding constraint on administrations with regard to promotions. So this is the real danger, that institutional autonomy is itself going to be significantly compromised because of the fact that administrations are going to have much greater control over the work life of teachers. And that is not and cannot be good news for the teaching community or for higher education. And therefore, in my view, as far as these regulations are concerned, Professor Bhagi said we should not just look at one clause here, but look at it in terms of a vision. So if one has to think of it in terms of a vision, then I think these regulations have to be not just amended. They would have to be discarded and we have to think afresh about what are equity definitions.